So I wanted to begin tonight with quoting the first rule of life by Tenzing Norbu, a former Tibetan monk and a ex-cop with the LAPD. And he said, rule number one is this: if you're open to learning, you get your life lessons delivered as gently as the tickle of a feather. But if you're defensive, if you stubbornly persist in being right, instead of learning the lesson at hand, if you stop paying attention to the tickles, the nudges, the clues, boom, sledgehammer. Now I thought, the Buddha couldn't have said it better, but in fact he did say it. Tenzing's is an update with kind of a jazzy twist. It's contemporary. Tenzing, who's also known as Ten, is actually a fictional character. He is the detective in a novel called The First Rule of 10, which I happened to get out from the library recently. The First Rule of 10. It's a really terrific novel, His first rule of life is basically, when you stop to think about it, it's a rephrasing of the Buddha's second and third noble truth. Let me explain what that was. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths as the very foundation and basics of his teaching, which many of you know, but maybe some of you don't. The first noble truth is that there's suffering in life. The second noble truth is that suffering comes from holding on. The third noble truth is, there's a release from suffering once we let go. And the fourth noble truth is what's called the Eightfold Path. It's 8 different practices, I guess you could say, 8 different features that we can practice in order to alleviate our suffering. Now, the Four Noble Truths have been called the elephant's footprints of the Buddha's teaching. And what that means is the elephant's footprints are really huge, and all the teaching goes right within it. So Tenzing's formulation, I think, is more what I would say calibrated than the Buddha's. Not only that, there's suffering because we hold on, but he says, the more you hold on, the more suffering there is. And then he says, the more you let go, the less suffering there is. So it's more calibrated than the Buddha's teaching. But in any case, I think what he is pointing out is the direction. What's important is the direction of our attention. Is your attention in or is it out? Is an inward or outward direction of your attention? We, as people, as most people do, tend to focus outward. We look out there. When something's going wrong, we want to look out there. That's happening. She said it. He said it. They did it. And we kind of point out there and find the blame out there. Our mindfulness practice shows us time and again that really the real source of our suffering is not just out there. It's in here. How we relate to what's going on out there. It's how we relate. And this is what we keep finding time after time. It's a pretty stunning insight as we begin to notice it. There's an African saying that I think is really appropriate here. It says, anytime you point a finger like that, there are 3 fingers pointing towards you. And that's not in blame. That's not a matter of blame. But saying, turn your attention from out there to what's going on in there and noticing, not as a matter that you've done something wrong, but noticing where you're holding on. Where you're not listening, as Tenzing would say, to the tickles of life. And instead, if you're really holding on hard to something that needs letting go of, you get the sledgehammer. You get the sledgehammer. Our mindfulness practice tells us that no matter how terrible the injustice, out there is we still need to look inside. Not because we necessarily have created it, although maybe we have some role in it, but to notice what our relationship to what's going on. What is your relationship? That's why we look inside. The inward gaze, inward and not outward. Now, this inward gaze isn't a matter of passivity. It's so easy, particularly when people first start hearing this, to think, oh, what? I'm not supposed to do anything? I'm just supposed to look inside? It means look inside in order to get some kind of clarity about what's really going on. What's the truth about your relationship to what's going on? Is it just anger, or is it just whatever it is? Notice it. Notice what's the truth. So it's not passivity. It's not being a doormat. It's about really noticing what's going on for you. How are you responding to this? When we notice closely, as Tenzing is suggesting, this feather, this tickle of a feather, we begin to hear life's little whispers. We don't have to wait for the sledgehammer. The little whispers of life. We can call this intuition. You get an intuition about something. Oh, right. We begin to listen to that little whisper and trust it as well. So, in the Old Testament, there's a wonderful story that really fits right in right here. And it's a story about God speaking to Solomon the king. And he asks Solomon, he said, Solomon, if I can give you anything that you want, what is it that you would take? And, I really am really touched by the story, because Solomon didn't say, I want a bigger kingdom, or, I want more wives, because apparently they had many wives in that time, or more wealth, or any of that. He said, I want a listening heart. A listening heart. And I think it's the same thing as what Tenzing is saying when he says, listen to the tickle of a feather, just to the little slight nudge. Same thing. It's interesting when you start really looking at these things. Different sources are saying the same thing in very different language. Very different language. So an intuition is a direct knowing. It's not a calculation of the pros and cons, but a direct knowing in the moment. So when we know directly, we notice when it is that we are holding on, when we're grasping at something that doesn't need grasping at. So the question for you is, or for each of us actually is what are we grasping? What are we holding on to? That needs letting go. Are we trying to be right? Or as Tenzing says, defensive. We could often try to be right instead of being real. Getting real about what life is really saying. Listening. Oh yeah, it's really saying that. But am I holding on because I want it my way? Sometimes we do. Sometimes we do. So the question that we, as practitioners in this path, we need to keep asking ourselves, is there something I need to let go of? Am I trying to force something to be, or people, or a situation to be in a certain way when they have no intention of doing that? Or am I fighting reality? And as we've often pointed out before, you can't fight reality and win, right? Yet oddly, we keep doing it. It just seems to be one of our quirks as human beings. We keep doing it. So really listening and noticing where we're hanging on. We want to be right, and it's a losing battle. So for each of us just to think about that, because there are always places. We always need to listen. I know that some of us, and I can relate to this, you think, oh, well, I've done this a lot. I've really done this a lot of times. You're never home free. It's something that you have to keep doing, and I mean listening. You always are nailed to the spot, in a sense, by listening. What's life saying now? what's life saying now? And you know what? If you find out that you really are holding on, no blame. It's like, oh, like what's new? Oh, here is something that I can let go of. Here's something that I can let go of. I have found there's something kind of interesting here. As you practice more, you discover that listening and holding on in particular has a kind of a texture to it. You can kind of feel it inside, the tightness, the hard edge. And if you're sensitive to it, you say, right. You listen. It becomes an ally. The texture of holding on can become an ally when you really get tuned into it. And it's saying, whoop, okay, you're doing it again. Just letting go, or taking a step in that direction if you can. It's not always so easy to do it. I am thinking about this word letting go. We use it all the time. The Buddha did too. And I like the word very much. I like the word bowing. I think it's another way of thinking about letting go. And for me, it invokes the sacredness of what we're doing, the bowing. In the Zen tradition, where I've studied in the Zen tradition, there's a saying, or practice in the Zen tradition, there's a saying, Buddhism will last as long as bowing lasts. Got to tell you, for a long time I didn't get it. What did that mean? And if you've ever been into a Zen, I don't know, meditation session or whatever, you'll notice they bow a lot. They walk in, and I've trained up in a monastery in California. They walk into the meditation hall, and you bow to the seat, you bow to the empty room, you're bowing all over the place. Buddhism will last as long as bowing lasts. You know what? They're not bowing to any particular thing, but it is a letting go. It's an homage in reverence to the mystery of life. And that means a letting go of our own holding on. So I really like this word, bowing. The problem with really bowing internally is that we often don't realize that we're holding on, that we are what Tenzing called being stubborn or defensive. It requires a good deal of awareness to realize when I'm being defensive and stubborn and I really want it to be my way. That requires some awareness, mindfulness to do that. We often don't realize that our habitual patterns of thought and behavior can be a way of holding on. We talk about this all the time here in many different contexts at IMCC. But for this particular talk, an example came up for me is if you're in a group and you are used to being simply in the limelight, you can kind of walk into the limelight and take the limelight whenever you get into a group. It just kind of can become a natural habit. Or if you're in a group and you're rather shy and you're used to being on the sidelines, this becomes your habit, your habitual reaction, and haven't thought of it. In both cases, our mindfulness practice says, notice what your pattern is. Maybe you're comfortable with being on the sideline, but do it mindfully. Be aware of what you're doing. Or maybe you're comfortable in the limelight. Be aware of what you're doing. Just being aware. This is profoundly a deep psychological practice. And again, we've talked about it often, and Sharon certainly talks about, all kinds of the nuances of our ways that we tend to react in habitual patterns. An example came up for me that happened many years ago when I was teaching. It was practically another lifetime. I was teaching history at university level, and we had evaluations periodically. Students were asked to sign the evaluation of the class. And I still remember very well one student's response, and he or she, they didn't sign their name, said, I wish that the teacher, me, would call on me because I'm just too shy to really speak up, but I wish they knew what I was thinking and would call on me. And I still remember that it was so poignant because I didn't know who it was. I didn't know who wanted to be called on. And then I thought, and now this came to my mind and I was creating this talk, I was thinking, I bet that student felt that they were grabbed and controlled by their shyness. And the difference is when we begin to practice mindfulness, all of a sudden it's a question of who controls who, or what controls what. We begin to realize we are not our shyness or any other habitual reaction that we find unwholesome. We're not. We can work with it, which it means in another way that we're not just controlled by our shyness or whatever. We can work with it in a way, I won't say we're in control of it, but we begin to be that. So it's both. But it's not just a passive victim of the shyness. This is what we begin to learn. So, holding on just isn't this aggressive kind of thing, my way or highway. It can be very subtle and very shy and very delicate. It calls on us to bow, and the task is enormous. And I think of bowing as being like a dancer. In the moment, what we're learning, as we're learning to let go, we learn to listen to the tickle. We tickle. It's like a dancer. You feel it, and you can shift if it feels right. This is ideally what can happen. For example, to go back to the speaking up in a group, which happens to be on my mind, if you don't have a big issue with it, and the conversation's going a certain way, and you have something to add, and maybe somebody else speaks up before you add it, and then the conversation goes off in another angle, what do? Do you take it back to where what you wanted to say? Maybe, maybe not. But noticing, here's an opportunity to be like a dancer. Are we going to be really subtle in our response, sensitive in our response? So dancing with all of this tickle of the feather, with compassion, I'd like to say. None of this is about blame. Instead of a dancer, we may be very clumsy, and we hit people over the head with the way we want to do it. Well, and people don't like it. That's okay. Just noticing that then. So compassion for ourselves, compassion for the others. Compassion. Recognizing our own fragility and everybody else's fragility as well. And as practitioners, we're trying our best. I'll say another image came up for me while I was thinking about this. This may sound weird. Did anybody play the game dodgeball when you were young? A few people, some even younger people played dodgeball. So it's not such an old-fashioned thing. Okay, so for those of you who have no clue about dodgeball, this is something that kids play. And I guess they're teams. And one team gets on two sides of the room up there and down here in a line. And then the other team stands in the middle. One ball. They start throwing the ball back and forth, and everybody's trying to dodge it. You're trying to dodge the ball. And it seemed to me, wow, this is really apropos here. This is really apt. Because we can begin to think about the tickles of life for the sledgehammers like dodgeball. We don't want to suffer. We're going to dodge the tickles or dodge the sledgehammers for sure. So we just dodge. In other words, trying to get away from suffering. And that's a good beginning reason. But you know what? Tenzing's first rule is not just about dodging like dodgeball. It's also embracing. Embracing the suffering as well. You don't just have to live a really full life. When the suffering happens, we need to realize this isn't just failure. Here is something that we can embrace and find meaning there. Some of these aren't just listening to the tickle. Sometimes just not a tickle. It is like a sledgehammer, because sometimes we can get really bad news. Maybe it's a diagnosis a serious illness, all kinds of really bad things that just come out of left field at us. This is no tickle. What do we do with it? We need to lean into it and embrace it. And someone who did that in a really powerful way is Philip Simons. This book, some of you may have read it, Learning to Fall. It is truly Simons, as a young man who was married with kids, was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS. And he wrote this book in the process as he was experiencing his degenerating condition. It's a neuromuscular disease that is degenerative and terminal. So Simons wrote this book about it, Learning to Fall. And of course he asked many questions as he was going through this process. Why me was one question. Don't we ask that? And he asked, what's the meaning in all this? Is there a meaning? What did God have in mind? What's divine meaning? And here's what he said, a response. And he said, wanting human suffering to fit some divine plan is like wanting to fly an airplane above a tornado wreckage and see that it spells out song lyrics or a cure for acne. At some point in life, the face of illness, violence, accident, or injustice, each of us confronts the possibility that rhyme and reason may not be on God's agenda. Simon goes on to say, from the depth of his own suffering, that to ask why, what's the divine meaning, to ask that question is the wrong question to ask of religion, the wrong question to ask of God. Because as he points, he doesn't say it quite in these words, but as the Buddhists and Hindus point out, life consists of 10,000 joys and 10,000 sorrows. That simply is what life is. It's not just the joys. It's also the sorrows, and that's just part of life. And so, as he points out, if we are experiencing the sorrows, we are simply experiencing life. It's not like life has made a mistake. This is what it is about. He then goes on to say, in such a touching way, that truly our paradise lies right in the experience, the deep embracing of our suffering. That's where it is. That's where the meaning, that's where we deeply can find the meaning. And that's why the subtitle of this book is The Blessings of an Imperfect Life. The Blessings of an Imperfect Life. He said, my life circumstances have pushed me more insistently than most to consider how a flawed life can still be a full one, how broken dreams can bring one more fully awake. And this book is a testimony to exactly that. Waking up through one's suffering, not in spite of it. And not saying, oh, I'm too busy right now with, and then fill in whatever the issue is, to wake up or to be aware. No, Simon's saying is right there in the suffering. That's where we wake up. And when he talks about waking up, he uses the word falling. Falling for Simon is the same as waking up. What's he falling into? Acceptance, surrender, letting go, and finally into emptiness. He's falling into emptiness. Here's what he says. Emptiness, like silence, like love, is not something we choose. It's not something we reason our way into, but rather something into which we fall, something in which we find ourselves. The fall into emptiness, into silence, has the nature of an accident, and we can't choose our accidents. We can learn to make ourselves accident-prone. Falling in the way I mean it means finding a stillness in the midst of life's calamitous downward rush. Silence, in fact, lies at the heart of spiritual practice. We prepare for the fall into emptiness. And in touching emptiness, we touch the source, the spring, the creative power out of which the universe flows at every moment. So Simon's learned to fall. He learned to live fully and live with grace. And he died in 2002. I think that ultimately when we come here to IMCC, at whatever our IMCC events are, Tuesdays or Wednesdays, Thursdays, any of our classes, I think that finally what we're doing is we're learning to fall, in Simon's way of speaking. Now, we may not phrase it like that. You may not phrase it like that to yourself. You may think, well, I'm coming here on a Tuesday night because I want a few minutes of just relative peace and quiet for a change in my week. You know? Or maybe you'll say, I'm coming because I want to get in touch with my breath or my body, or I want to improve my marriage, or whatever. We've got our many, many different reasons. But ultimately, I would say that we, in coming here, are learning to fall. All of the things and reasons why we know or feel that we're coming are important in their own right. But I think they're not the ultimate effect of our coming here. Simon's conclusion is really beautifully written. He said, some of us go willingly to the edge. Some of us are driven to it. And some of us find ourselves there by grace. But all of us get there sometime in our life, when through the gateway of the present moment, we glimpse something beyond. And when we do, may we open ourselves to wonder. May we surrender to the mystery that passes understanding. May we find ourselves at the threshold of this eternal life. So I think this is really, these are words that are really are addressed to every single one of us and touch our hearts. And then I couldn't resist. I wanted to read a poem at the end. Because, there are many different ways of saying the same thing. And there's a poem by Hafiz, the Sufi poet, that I truly, many of his poems I think are wonderful. This one is called If the Falling of a Hoof. I think he's saying the same thing as Simon's did in different language. Here it is. If the falling of a hoof ever rings the temple bells, if a lonely man's final scream before he hangs himself, and the nightingale's perfect lyric of happiness all become an equal cause to dance, then the sun has at last parted its curtain before you. God has stopped playing child's games with your mind and dragged you backstage by the hair and shown to you the only possible reason for this bizarre and spectacular existence. Go running through the streets, creating divine chaos. Make everyone and yourself ecstatically mad for the friend's beautiful open arms. Go running through the world, giving love, love, love. I'm going to read this one again. Yeah. If the falling of a hoof ever rings the temple bells, if a lonely man's final scream before he hangs himself, and the nightingale's perfect lyric of happiness all become an equal cause to dance, then the sun has at last parted its curtain before you. God has stopped playing child's games with your mind and dragged you backstage by the hair and shown to you the only possible reason for this bizarre and spectacular existence. Go running through the streets, creating divine chaos. Make everyone in yourself ecstatically mad for the friend's beautiful open arms, and that's friend is a capital F. Go running through this world, giving love, love, love. I think he's saying exactly the same thing, falling into emptiness. All an equal cause to dance. Thank you for listening.